Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Cancer Talks podcast. We've set out to uplift personal stories of transformation from people whose lives have been touched by cancer. I'm Cheryl Buck, and I will be guiding our conversation today. Since around 2008, I've been thinking about the narrative that surrounds cancer, which I have come to realize over the years is the dominant narrative. One way to broaden that narrative, we think, is to hear stories from people all over the world who've been touched by cancer. Our first guest, Jan Adrian, is here to bring us her story. As the founder of Healing Journeys, Jan hosted dozens of conferences to empower people with cancer to move from surviving to thriving. Hi, Jan. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi. Well, I just can't thank you enough for being our first guest on the new Cancer Talks podcast.
You're welcome.
Couldn't have asked for a better story and a better person to tell the story. I just want to say that we met after we launched Cancer Talks in the summer of 2020. And we've talked quite regularly on the phone, and we're compadres and friends. And I'm just so thrilled that you're helping launch this new era of Cancer Talks.
And I'm also thrilled. I'm thrilled that you're doing what you're doing because I think it's time for something new. I mean, I've done what I did for 25 years, but I'm 79 years old now, and it's time for somebody young like you to take it over and start doing something. So I'm really excited that you're doing these Cancer Talks.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm excited too. And, there are just so many stories out there of personal transformation.
Yes.
Via a cancer diagnosis. So I'm really looking forward to offering this platform to whoever wants to use it to tell their story. So
that's great.
But you're the first. So
okay, I feel honored.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Well, why don't we start out with, thought maybe you could just talk a little bit about what I'm calling your early life, like maybe pre-diagnosis.
I was diagnosed when I was 47. When I was 16, I was a junior in high school. I was homeschooled for a whole semester because I couldn't go to school, because I was running a continual fever. I was fatigued all the time. I was sick, and my parents took me to medical doctors, and they could not find anything wrong with me. And by not being able to name the illness, they didn't know how to treat it. So my parents finally took me to a practitioner who was not a medical doctor. He was a chiropractor. And he told me that it didn't matter what we ever named the illness, that it didn't have to have a name, but that our bodies are meant to self-heal. We have self-healing abilities or self-healing mechanisms, and our immune system is meant to take care of whatever is going on, and that we needed to strengthen my body so it would be able to take care of whatever was wrong. And he used a pendulum, which was the first time I'd ever seen a pendulum used, to determine what I should and shouldn't eat. And his major treatment was nutritional. He told me not to eat anything white, no white sugar, no white flour. There were lots of do's and don'ts. I had to do nutmeg and vinegar and lots of vegetables. But anyhow, I followed his diet, and within 6 months, I was probably healthier than I had ever been in my life. All of my symptoms went away. I no longer was fatigued. I didn't run a fever. And before that, I probably had the flu every winter, and I don't think I had the flu for 20 years after that incident. And my hair got curly during that time. It had been straight before that. So that was a major influence in my life. So that's part of who I was, somebody who knew that the medical world didn't have all the answers, and somebody who could trust my body. When my parents were taking a trip to Kansas, it was during the school year, and I was in junior high school, and my parents were taking a trip to go to a conference of the Mennonite Central Committee in Kansas. I was raised as a Mennonite. And they wanted me to go along on this trip, and I just felt like it wasn't right, like I shouldn't go. And it was the first time I ever really went against my father, who was very strict, and I just refused to go. And my father was very upset with me. But since I didn't go, they took 2 passengers with them on that trip, and I stayed with my mother's sister and her husband while they were gone. And they were supposed to be coming home on a Friday night, and about 9 o'clock on that Friday night, I just started crying, and my aunt asked me what was wrong, and I said, something has happened to my parents. And she said, oh, you're just imagining things. I'm sure they'll be home tomorrow. In a very serious car accident at 9 o'clock the night before. And the 2 passengers in the car had been killed. And my parents were in a hospital in Mojave, in the Mojave Desert. So somebody took me there to visit them. What I learned from that also has impacted my whole life was that I have intuition that I can trust.
Yes.
And that incident changed the way my father related to me, I think, the rest of our lives, because he was so happy that I wasn't on that trip, because if I would have been sitting in the seat where one of the people got killed.
Oh my, wow. So my intuition saved my life and changed, and we think, oh, I felt like I should have not done that ahead of time, but I didn't follow my intuition. So it's always really good to have an example that's really strong in your life when you followed your intuition and it turned out to be true. Exactly.
It turned out to be what was meant to happen. I mean, it seemed like an awful thing to be happening when I was 16, but it's been such a fortunate thing that another lesson I learned from that is that something that may feel like a negative in the moment can turn out to be a real positive in one's life.
Yes. Ooh, that's a good one.
Another part of who I was is that I had my master's degree in psychiatric social work, and I had a holistic health center, and we had been teaching classes on mind-body health way before it was trendy. We ran the Center for Health Awareness from 1978 to 1985. So that's when I was teaching nurses continuing education classes on mind-body health. I'm telling you those things because they had a huge impact on how I reacted and what my response was when I was diagnosed with cancer.
Yes, absolutely.
I was first diagnosed with breast cancer in my left breast. And I'm really a textbook example of, they say that it takes a few years. Some people say 2, some people say more than 2, but for cancer to develop and to look back and see what happened in your life 2 or 3 years before you were diagnosed with cancer. So 3 years before my cancer diagnosis, let me back up even farther. I was married at age 30 and then divorced from that husband at age 37. And we had a son who at the time of the divorce was 2, and that son, Brian, lived with me. And when he was 10, I really felt like he needed to be with his father. I won't go into all the details, but there were a lot of indications that he needed his father, and his father had remarried and really wanted him to live with them. They had 2 other children, and I was an only child, and I hated it. And I swore I'd never have an only child, but then I had one and my husband and I divorced, and I couldn't have more. So anyhow, when Brian was 10, I let him go live with his father. And that was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. And it was 3 years after that I was diagnosed with breast cancer in the left breast. And there are some theories that say that breast cancer in the left breast is related to a mother-child relationship.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah. And I was also, at that time, working in a job that was not fulfilling. My second husband, I had remarried, and my second husband and I owned a furniture store together. because we had started this retail business, we were working 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day. So my life was just about work, and it was not fulfilling. It was something that was my husband's dream, and I was doing it to work with him, but it wasn't a job that was feeding me.
Mm-hmm.
And because we were so busy, I wasn't really taking care of myself. So even though I had learned so much about nutrition, I would say for 2 years before my diagnosis, I was not paying attention to nourishing myself either physically, emotionally, or mentally.
Mm-hmm.
So I was eating junk food. We had a McDonald's right down the street, a Dairy Queen right next door, a Kentucky Fried Chicken, Taco Bell. That's how I was eating because I didn't have time to shop or cook. And I was not going to movies. I was not walking in nature. I was just working.
Wow.
So it's, in retrospect, it's really easy to see why I got cancer. I didn't see all that at the moment that it happened. I mean, my first reaction was, oh shit, why is this happening to me? But eventually I figured it out. So that first diagnosis was in 1989. And, well, I had a mastectomy. And then out of fear, I started chemo, and I only did one round, one infusion. And because of what happened to me when I was 16 and my belief in my body's immune system, I could not continue with chemotherapy because I felt like it was destroying the very thing I needed to heal. So I didn't continue with chemo. A year later, when I had a recurrence, I did have radiation. And then I had another recurrence 4 years after that. And then for a number of years, I would have recurrences under my arm. I would have a lump under my arm every year, and I would have it surgically removed. Because I had breast cancer that was estrogen receptor positive, I did various treatments of like tamoxifen and Arimidex and Femara, things that are aromatase inhibitors that block estrogen. But I kept having recurrences. And then in 2002 was another turning point. So this was, 13 years after my first diagnosis. I had another recurrence on the left side and a new cancer on the right side. And that's when I realized that my second marriage was a toxic relationship for me and that I needed to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a major turning point. And so I made several changes. In 2002, I left my husband. I had a husbandectomy. I quit working in the furniture store. I had started the nonprofit Healing Journeys, and I started doing that full time. And I moved to Sacramento, to another town. We had been living in Santa Cruz. And I totally changed my diet because prior to that, I had read that anyone with a cancer diagnosis needs to be on a low-fat vegetarian diet. So that's what I had been doing for 12 years, low-fat vegetarian, and I kept having recurrences and recurrences. And then I read a book in 2002 that was about eating for your metabolic type. Not your blood type, but your metabolic type, which I had never heard of before. And so I found somebody who could test me for my metabolic type. There were only 4 types. And they told me that for my particular type, I needed to eat meat at every meal. So I started eating meat again. And of course, I was always doing a lot of research because I would say my major treatment was always nutrition. So I was always trying to keep up on the research on that. And it's amazing how much we've learned about nutrition since 1989. But at that time, I learned that mostly the research that had been done that showed that meat was carcinogenic had been done with conventionally raised meat,
Mm-hmm.
which we all know is carcinogenic now, but that there had also been studies done in Europe using animals, beef especially, that was grass-fed and grass-finished, and that eating that meat was actually cancer protective. That it's not just that all meat is bad, but that we're eating what the meat ate. So if a cow is eating grass, then we're getting that into our system. But if a cow is eating antibiotics and pesticides and foods that they don't naturally eat, then they're getting sick and we're getting that into our system.
Right.
So anyhow, I also radically changed my diet in 2002.
Uh-huh.
And then, just to continue with cancer, in 2007, I had ocular melanoma as a new cancer. It was not a metastasis, it was a new cancer. And with that one, there are two treatments for ocular melanoma. One is to remove the eye. The other is proton beam radiation. And proton beam radiation at the time was only done 3 places in the United States, and one of them was 20 minutes from my house.
Wow.
So I found out that there's a 97% cure rate for proton beam radiation, so it seemed like a no-brainer, and I didn't know of any side effects to that. So I did the proton beam radiation. That was in 2007, and that I continue to see the eye tumor specialist. Used to be every 3 months, then every 6 months, now every year, and that has not recurred. That it hasn't metastasized.
That's great.
But my breast cancer metastasized to my lungs and my ribs in 2011.
Wow.
And the only Western medical treatment that I did is I had a cryoablation of a tumor in my lung, which means that they went in through the back, through a CT scan into the tumor in the lung, and put in a chemical that froze it. So that dealt with the major tumor, but there were still little tumors in my lungs and on my ribs. And I did not do any other Western medical treatment, but I continued to learn about diet and supplements. I worked with naturopathic doctors. And then I read Radical Remission, and the factors that she came up with in Radical Remission became my major treatment. I could talk more about that in a minute. But anyhow, when I had a PET scan, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, the pathologist called me after the scan, and he said, I want to know what you're doing, because according to your chart, you're not doing any treatment. But I just did a PET scan, and it's so different from your last one that I want to know what you've been doing, because the cancer in your lungs and in your ribs is totally gone.
Wow.
His word was resolved. It's been resolved.
Yeah.
So what are you doing? So mainly, I don't know if the people in the audience know about the Radical Remission strategies, so I have to talk about those.
Okay.
Because I think it's huge. Kelly Turner did her PhD thesis on spontaneous remissions from cancer, and she traveled the world for a year interviewing people who had spontaneous remissions from cancer. She said she would no longer use the word spontaneous because there was nothing spontaneous about them, because these people had worked very hard for their remissions. And she wrote the book Radical Remission. She called it Radical Remission. And she found 9 strategies that all of them had used. There were 75 strategies total that people had used, but all of them had used these 9. Mm-hmm. And only 2 of them are physical. And that's radically changing your diet and using herbs and supplements. And all the rest are psychosocial, spiritual. So it's taking control of your health, following your intuition, which I had learned about many years before that, releasing suppressed emotions, increasing positive emotions, embracing social support, deepening your spiritual connection, and having strong reasons for living.
Beautiful. Wow.
So following those 9 strategies has really been my treatment for at least the last 5 years.
Yeah. Wow. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Not what we think it's going to be, right? Not what the average person out there thinks a treatment plan would consist of that. Yeah.
Right. I think probably, the first one on here is taking control of your health. And so many people go to an oncologist and they say, you have to do chemo, and they take that seriously and they do chemo, or whatever they say you have to do. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when I tell people part of my story and they say, well, didn't you have to do chemo? And I say, what do you mean by have to? And I said, well, didn't the doctor tell you to do chemo? And I said, yes, he did. He told me I had to do chemo. That doesn't mean I had to do chemo.
That's right. Okay, that speaks volumes about you, Jan, about who you are. I just say kudos to you.
Thank you.
You know, from everything that you've, your whole history of diagnoses, I think an indication of why you say that you're living with cancer, and you have been living with cancer.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that? You know, the part about it that that I find fascinating is that if someone is living with cancer, that means to me that, death's door is always a little bit cracked open. And one then has to be in a way or deal with that on a regular basis. And I'm just wondering how that showed up for you, or still does, because, you didn't say, but I'm thinking that you probably are continuing to, quote unquote, live with cancer.
Yes. I should say that on my last PET scan, which I think was January of 2019, I still had two small foci, I don't know how to pronounce that. The two spots in the lining of my other lung, the lining of my left lung, that are the size of the tip of a ballpoint pen, that are not big enough to biopsy. But there is still cancer. And when I have a quarterly blood test, they test a cancer marker, and the CA27.29, which is a breast cancer marker, the normal is 38, and my number has been in the thousands for years.
Wow.
So,
and what do the doctors say about that?
My doctor says as long as it remains stable, it's been in the 3,000 range for several years now. And she said, I won't worry about it unless it goes up by 20%. Mm-hmm. And it's gone up a little bit, but then the next time it goes down a little bit. So that number has been relatively stable for the last 2 years.
Yes.
But it's there. So I know that cancer is there. So you're right that I am living with cancer.
Yes.
In the beginning, every time I would have a recurrence, I would start out with an oh shit reaction. Mm-hmm. Thinking, what am I doing wrong? What am I not doing? What can I do differently? Is it time for me to do some kind of toxic treatment? Or is it time for me to say, okay, I give up, it's time for me to die? I've asked myself that question many, many times. Mm-hmm. And I won't know. I mean, I don't know when that time comes. But where I've come to each time is that I think anything that washes up on my beach, anything that happens to me, is there for my growth. I believe that I'm a spiritual being first, who's living in a human body rather than a human being who may or may not have a spiritual life. I'm a spiritual being first.
Yes. And
that the spirit always outlives the body. Mm-hmm. And that what happens to my body and anything that happens to me in this earth school is here for the growth of my spirit.
Yes.
So I can use whatever happens to me for the growth of my spirit. So I always wind up looking for the silver lining or looking for the gift, and how can I use this to live a better life?
Yes.
So by growing my spirit, I'm also improving the quality of my life here on earth too.
Yes.
So I've learned so many things. I mean, even just following the 9 strategies that I talked about from Radical Remission, mm-hmm. doing all of those things makes my life so much better.
Yes.
And if I didn't have cancer, I wouldn't have even read the book. I wouldn't be doing those things.
Right.
Years ago, I was talking with a cancer coach who asked me the question. He said, if your cancer suddenly went away and you had no cancer, would you continue doing all the things that you are doing to have a better life? Would you continue exercising every day? Would you continue eating healthy food? Would you continue deepening your spiritual life? And I said, probably not. And he said, then you need to still have your cancer.
Oh. Drat.
Because cancer is the motivating factor for me to to continue to make my life better.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. So you have, time after time, came up a life-threatening challenge after challenge
Yes.
after challenge for many, many years. And you actually turned that challenge into a life-changing opportunity more than once.
Yes, yes.
Well, you had so many diagnoses that you had many transformations. But I'd like to get to not your final transformation, but what you started with Healing Journeys. Because, well, I personally see that as that you took a life-challenging or a life-threatening challenge and turned it into this opportunity that served thousands of people. And I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Short. Within a year or two after my diagnosis, I went to a conference down at the Disneyland Hotel in Anaheim that was for continuing education for health professionals, because I was maintaining my license as a psychiatric social worker.
Mm-hmm.
Let me back up a minute. Once I was diagnosed, because I had come from a background of teaching mind-body health, I was really looking for help with dealing with my cancer, not just on a physical level, but emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And I was having a hard time finding resources. This was in 1989, and there weren't books on the subject back then.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked my oncologist, I said, all the treatment you're recommending are just treatments of the body, and how are we going to treat the rest of me? And he literally yelled at me. He raised his voice and he said, emotions have nothing to do with this.
Boy.
And I absolutely knew that wasn't true, because I had been teaching nurses mind-body health, and I know the body and the mind are totally interconnected, and that the emotions had to do with it. But then I was concerned about, what if people that don't have the background I did would hear those words and they might believe it? So anyhow, it was with that kind of question in my mind that I went to this conference down in Southern California. And one of the speakers there was Jean Shinoda Bolen, and she spoke about illness as a disease of the soul, and she used Greek mythology as a metaphor of going into the underworld. And as she was the first person that I heard use the phrase, we're spiritual beings on a human path. Mm-hmm. And I was so moved by what she was saying. I felt like she was talking just to me, because it was what I was hungering for. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting there crying the whole time she was talking. And when she finished, there was an immediate standing ovation of about 900 health professionals, wow. Doctors, nurses, social workers. And I thought, wow, I'm not the only one who felt like she was talking to me, that everybody resonated with this. So I decided at that conference that I was going to create something like that for people living on the front lines, for those of us with cancer, not for health professionals. Mm-hmm. So I created a 2-day conference called Cancer as a Turning Point, From Surviving to Thriving. And Jean Shinoda Bolen was a speaker at that first conference. Oh, wow. And I would have some speakers who were well-known, who had authored books, but then I would also have people tell their healing stories, and I always had music and humor, which are the languages of the spirit. So that conference, that first one, was in 1994, I think. And it was so successful in terms of the response that I got. And it was amazing. People would say it saved my life. And it just started a new conversation about cancer.
Wow.
So I started a nonprofit called Healing Journeys to do the conference. And over 25 years, we did, I think, 37 conferences all around the country. In the beginning, I was charging $200 for the conference. And in the first 2 years, I did 5 conferences, and I was $35,000 in debt because it didn't pay for itself.
Yeah.
And then I had the out-of-the-box thought of, what if we did it for free? What would happen? And so in 1996, I got some really well-known speakers to agree to speak at no charge. And I got Stanford University somehow to give us their auditorium at no charge. And we did our first free conference, and 1,400 people showed up.
Oh, my gosh.
Before that, our average attendance had been 150.
Yeah. Wow.
So by that time, I had a board of directors for the nonprofit, and the board said, we will always do it free because we want to serve as many people as we can.
Yes.
So part of my job, of course, became fundraising because I had to raise the money to do the conference.
Right.
That conference at Stanford was the first one ever that paid for itself because we asked for donations, and there were 1,400 people to make donations. But I also had gotten everything donated, so we had very few expenses. And the people that spoke said they would speak at no charge for that one on the condition that I never ask them to do that again.
Oh.
So I had to pay my speakers, I had to pay for venues, I had to pay for marketing, and I would say that the average cost was around $75,000 to $100,000 for one of those conferences. So I had to raise the money to do that. But it gave me such a strong purpose in life because I was making such a difference in so many lives, and I know more than 25,000 people have attended that conference over the years. And I meet people in the weirdest places that I don't know, but they know me because they've seen me on stage at the conference.
Right.
So I was in San Francisco once, and this woman that I didn't know stopped me and said, "Are you the woman that did that cancer conference?" And I said, yes. And she literally threw her arms around me and just started bawling, crying.
Oh.
And it was so sweet. She said, "I want you to know you saved my life." She said, "I had been diagnosed with cancer, and I thought it was a death sentence. And I was home dying. I was just shriveling up and dying. And my friend took me kicking and screaming to your conference. And she said, it made me realize that cancer can be a life sentence. And I totally did a turning point at that event, and I am now well and happy and cancer-free."
Oh, my goodness.
So,
Wow.
I mean, that's one experience. I've had things like that happen so many times in places that I wouldn't even expect, where somebody recognizes me and tells me what an impact it had on their life.
Yes.
So it gave my life meaning. And one of the strategies in the Radical Remission book is having strong reasons for living.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always been a spiritual person, and I love the prayer of St. Francis, and my prayer has been, make me an instrument, to use me, my gifts somehow. What am I supposed to be doing in this world? And in retrospect, it almost seems like a diagnosis of cancer was an answer to that prayer.
Yes.
That it gave me a direction for my life that never would have happened without that diagnosis.
Yes. Absolutely. There are so many people that I'm finding that find cancer to guide them towards their highest purpose in life.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
it led me to leaving a relationship that was toxic for me, and to leaving a job that was not good. I mean, it was a really strong motivator. It really was a turning point. I mean, that the name of the conference, Cancer as a Turning Point from Surviving to Thriving, has really been my story.
Yes. It speaks the truth. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Oh, thank you so much for sharing all of this, Jan. I know I've heard you talk about these different aspects of your life, but to hear it all now, just in this amount of time, it's so powerful. And pretty sure you're not just sitting at home now. I don't think you could do that.
So what I'm doing now, because when COVID hit, of course, we can't do Healing Journeys, can't do events anymore, and so I went through a little period of wondering, so what's my purpose now? What am I supposed to be doing? Mm-hmm. And so what I'm doing now is doing book groups on Zoom through Healing Journeys, but probably the major thing I'm doing is I'm writing my memoir.
Fantastic.
A cancer memoir. And I used to think I couldn't write a cancer memoir because I wasn't cancer-free, because most cancer memoirs are about, I got cancer, this is what I learned, this is what I did, and now I'm cancer-free, living happily ever after, and I never got there. And I also have thought there's such a glut of cancer memoirs on the market that I didn't want to add to that. But I've been convinced by other people that my story is unique, that they haven't read a story about somebody who's actually lived with cancer. Mm-hmm. And that can be inspiring to people who are petrified of getting a recurrence, to know that cancer does not have to be a death sentence and that it can actually be a life sentence.
Yes. Oh, that's beautiful.
So
yes.
Anyhow, I am working on writing my memoir.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
I look forward to that. I can't get enough of your story. I love it. It's inspiring. And,
Thank you.
And it also kind of makes me think, I got a cancer diagnosis 5 years ago. And, I don't know that I don't think it won't recur. Like, I almost feel like I'm living with cancer, even though it's not showing up.
Yes.
So I think that's, I think that probably other people feel that way too. There's always that
yes.
Fear in the background. And like you said, that you needed that cancer diagnosis to continue to do the things that were making you healthy.
Right.
And that would keep you healthy. So
right.
Anyway, well, you have a wonderful story. You have a wonderful way of telling your story. Is there anything else that you want to add?
I mean, I have a lot more stories, but if I told you all of them, then nobody would have to buy the book. So I have to leave. I have to leave some stories to be in the book.
Okay, good point. I think that pretty much everyone on the planet can say in one way or another that their lives have been touched by cancer. Cancer Talks is a storytelling platform for everyone, not just for people who have had a cancer diagnosis. We really look forward to hearing your story. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review in your podcast app to help others find us. This episode was produced by Claire DeLaslo, music and editing by Annie Mernigan. A very special thanks to Kate Amenrud, and our deepest gratitude to all of our donors. Believe me when I say we could not do this without you.